Hi, welcome to the meeting of the Science Engineering Council. Good to see a full room. I know it's online, so it's great to have the audience. And before I introduce Dr. Martinez for Space Talk, just want to say hello and welcome again, everybody. Thanks for making your contributions to today's meeting. Those donations mean a lot. And if you're not already a member, feel free to talk to any one of the board members. There's some of us here, and you can go to our website, science.org, and so in terms of upcoming meetings, this is March. The Santa Barbara County Science Fair is happening in April, right? That's coming up like in the sorry, this week. It's happening now. And so what we do every year is host the winners of the county science fair, and we invite you to see their displays and listen to their talks, because oftentimes they're heading from there on to the state. So that's an important meeting for us. I believe that will be our April meeting. May, I don't know that we have anybody lined up quite yet, but for June, our own John Ilgen will be talking to us on artificial intelligence. I don't know if you want to say any more about that upcoming talk.
But sure. I'll be talking about artificial intelligence from the standpoint of how do you verify and validate and accredit an AI product that you're going to be using. I will go through that verification and validation process in as much depth as the time allows. And I will also be incorporating in the discussion the use of models and simulations, and the huge databases, both models and simulations and AI has, and how do you verify and validate? I'll be talking about that.
Okay, so that's going to be great. Okay, so again, if you have ideas on speaking topics or speakers, by all means, reach out to us. We're very much interested in hearing your ideas and having you participate. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Dr. Larry Martinez, Professor Emeritus, Political Science at Cal State Long Beach, and a PhD graduate at UC Santa Barbara. He helped develop early U.S. policies for private satellite networks and commercial rocket launches. Fulbright Senior Research Fellow in Germany. His work focuses on cyberspace and outer space governance. He lectures globally, serves with the International Institute of Space Law. It was named the 2026 Distinguished Researcher by the Pacific Telecommunications Conference. So with that, I welcome Dr. Martinez to our talk today.
All right. So welcome to everybody here in this room and everybody listening wherever they are on Zoom. And thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially speaking to a local audience. I grew up in San Luis Obispo, California, and right from the very beginning, there was a very, let's say, heavy emphasis on outer space. And we had in the reconstructed high school in San Luis Obispo that they had to tear down the old one because of the Field Act, because it was built out of brick, and it took a huge wrecking ball to tear it down. They built up a new high school that had a planetarium in it, and that had a very big effect and on young people getting interested in outer space, and it did on me. Because right from the very beginning, we had access then to really, at the time in the 1960s, state-of-the-art, let's say, educational experiences on learning about outer space. And this was partnered with our own experiences, because from San Luis Obispo, as from Santa Barbara, we are both within approximately the same distance from Vandenberg Air Force Base. And so we could see from San Luis Obispo, as they can see today, but back in the 60s, you could see the missile tests going up from Vandenberg from San Luis Obispo, and that further heightened our interest. And then getting involved with the amateur radio club at Cal Poly as a high school student was also a very big influence, because right from the very beginning, in order to pass the amateur radio test, and Bill knows this very well, he's one of the leading lights of the Santa Barbara Amateur Radio Club, is that you quickly became very conscious of spectrum issues, and especially then international regulation of spectrum, which in the 1960s was just gaining now let's say, the fundamentals for regulating satellites in outer space. And this quickly expanded as the Soviet Union and the United States, later Europe and other countries, started launching missions not only into Earth orbit, but also to nearby planets. And in 1969, one of the big challenges for the amateur radio community was setting up Moon, Earth bouncing off of the moon. So amateur radio operators were setting up huge antennas on the ground, bouncing them off the moon and receiving the echoes back, and they were communicating then using the moon as a giant reflector rather than an active or passive satellite in Earth orbit. But the ultimate, what amateur radio operators call DX, which stands for distance communications, was that there were a group of amateurs who were attempting then to build giant antennas that they could use to monitor the lunar communications between the astronauts and the lunar module. And so we knew what the frequencies were. And so the ultimate DX was to hear live then some of the lunar communications. And in my work I do now is that I just spent several days in Vienna in November at a conference with the United Nations in Vienna, where we were looking at what are the implications of commercial companies operating on the moon. And so you think back, 6 decades back when we were talking about Apollo and its missions to the moon. And now you can see that on the moon, we now have commercial companies landing on the moon. Some successfully, some not so successfully. But nonetheless, it raises a lot of issues that have a lot to do with how are we going to regulate and govern these new areas of human activity, both in cyberspace and outer space. And these are the two areas of, let's say, political science research that I'm involved with. I'm not a lawyer, even though I belong to the International Institute of Space Law, which is a group of over 300 mainly lawyers, but our organization is a non-governmental, nonprofit organization that promotes the governance and the rule of law into one of these new areas of human activity, which is outer space. And so my talk today is, what do we do with all of these new entrants into the outer space arena? And so I'll be talking about what's going on now. I'm about to leave in about 3 weeks for Vienna for the legal subcommittee. And I'm part of a special task force that is looking specifically at how do we regulate the burgeoning numbers of commercial space missions and space objects up there, both on the moon, Earth orbit, and increasingly we're looking at things such as asteroid mining. We're looking at private companies being the prime movers and shakers. I mean, if you look at SpaceX and what Elon Musk has been promoting for many years now, along with Buzz Aldrin, who was one of the original people promoting missions to Mars, is that it could very well likely be that it is mainly a commercial mission that is involved with interplanetary exploration rather than just purely governmental led missions. And there's a whole panoply of issues that to us in the outer space governance field is very, very fascinating. If anyone has any questions, please raise them at any time. And I know that is anyone in the audience professionally with or was with the outer space engineering or task forces or anything going on here? Because Galita, UCSB, I mean, I went to a Santa Barbara astronomical unit public viewing out here at El Camino Marketplace. And I was just talking to another guy with a telescope. And I asked him, how'd you get involved with this? And he says, well, I helped design the lunar rover here. And it was designed here in Galita. This is indeed a very special place. Okay, so legal regime change. What we're looking at here is what is the international legal regime? So a legal regime means what are the agreements that form the norms that govern behaviors. And one of the big norms of behaviors is rule set behaviors. So if you have something set in a rule that the collectivity agrees with, then that establishes, even if it's an ungoverned area, such as outer space, but we also have examples of Antarctica, the deep seabed. We have other planets. We have things that are in the atmosphere and so forth. So these are outside of normal, what we would say are state territorial boundaries. But how do we govern these areas, these commons that are becoming increasingly important in the world today? And for outer space, there are 5 treaties that form what you could call the Constitution for outer space. And so the first one is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And it was probably the bedrock of what later has become now this legal regime. And it establishes the principles behind governance in outer space. And there's 2 really big aspects of this. Is that one, outer space exploration by the treaty that's been ratified by well over 150 countries is going to be for the interests of all people on Earth. That is to say that outer space exploration and the benefits from outer space exploration and use will be available and they will benefit all mankind, to use the mankind word. If anybody thinks of something better, please let me know. The other big principle is embodied into the Outer Space Treaty is to demilitarize outer space. And this is a very tricky thing because outer space from the very beginning has been militarized. It was all the rockets that were put up were all military rockets. And so the aspect of maintaining outer space for peaceful purposes has had to thread a very, very thin line through a very, very difficult needle in order to, let's say, establish what is permissible under the Outer Space Treaty with regard to military personnel, military satellites, and so forth. And this is what the Outer Space Treaty attempts to do, which is basically it bans, one, weapons of mass destruction. Secondly, it bans then the establishment of military bases in outer space or on celestial bodies. But thirdly, it does not ban military personnel from going up into outer space, nor does it ban the use of outer space for military purposes. For instance, ballistic missiles go into outer space on their trajectories. There are military satellites up there, but they are not bases as it would be defined then by the Outer Space Treaty. Again, we can go more into this, but it has a direct implication for what this talk is going to arrive at, which is how do we deal with the legal ambiguities about non-governmental systems operating in outer space for military purposes. And so this raises further a giant problem, because if you look at the date here, 1967, and it was preceded by United Nations resolutions from 1963 and even before that, is that in the early days, outer space was only the province of governments because it was so expensive and it was so difficult to get up into outer space. The only way you could do it was with a government-built rocket. And the government-built rockets are the direct descendants of the Werner von Braun German efforts in World War II. And so they brought the V-2 rockets back from Germany, back to the United States, and they were the first rockets that were really operational that could reach outer space altitudes. And it proved the technology, and we brought the scientists. And so who was one of the lead designers of the moon rocket, the Saturn V? It was Werner von Braun, who was following his childhood dream of interplanetary travel. He got waylaid by Adolf Hitler, but then he came to the United States and was one of the leading lights on the development of the Saturn V moon rocket, which was for only civilian purposes. However, if you have a lot of payload capacity, who else is looking at putting payload up into orbit? And of course, it's Department of Defense. And so from the very beginning of the whole space age, starting with Robert Goddard in the 1920s and 1930s, is that there has always been a great interest going back even hundreds or even farther back, I don't know if it's 1,000 years. The Chinese were launching rockets and fireworks back probably at least 1,000 years ago. And a lot of that was for military purposes. So you can see there's a lot of ambiguity here that has to be written into an international treaty in order to establish norms that accomplish your two big aims: outer space for the benefit of all countries, regardless of their engineering or technological or scientific level of development. And secondly is to demilitarize outer space, and especially to prohibit the stationing or the orbiting of weapons of mass destruction, thinking about nuclear weapons. Nobody wants to see nuclear weapons in orbit. We have nuclear power sources in orbit, and we can talk about that later. But this is the core of the international legal regime. Any questions so far? Yes, sir.
All these documents or whatever understandings are like on paper. Who keeps them?
Yeah, the United Nations, the Secretary General. And the Secretary General's office is about to get a lot more paperwork. But that's to register a treaty, you have to do it through the United Nations in order to have the treaty established as international law, because, and you're all from California, I take it, what is the number one thing Californians think about? Lawsuits, okay? And you have to be able to sue somebody, right? So if somebody does you wrong, you think about, I'm going to file a lawsuit against somebody. And the only time you can use a treaty on the basis of a lawsuit is it's registered. And so this then is one of the big, let's say, need to do on everybody's list, is that, and why countries sign up for these treaties, because, well, we'll get to it in a second. Okay, the second treaty was the rescue of astronauts and return of objects. Space technology is very, very secretive because it involves the very highest levels of engineering and science. what happens if your satellite or your astronaut, let's say crewed vehicle lands someplace it's not supposed to land? Sorry. What happens if it lands someplace? What is to, let's say, protect its secrets on board the satellite and the status of the astronauts? And what this agreement establishes is that astronauts have a special legal status similar to diplomats. So in other words, a astronaut is called an envoy of mankind. And if the space vehicle lands someplace, even in an antagonistic country, if they're a party to the treaty, they are not to interfere with the astronauts. You can't arrest them or do terrible things to them. And you are not supposed to, let's say, interfere with the operations of the space vehicle. This establishes the space vehicle with a legal status similar to that of a diplomatic embassy that has diplomatic immunity. So this establishes then what the norms are about if a satellite lands in your country's territory and that satellite went off course and landed someplace on your territory that wasn't supposed to land. Okay. 1968. 1972, we get then to the real money issue, which is the liability convention. And this, in addition to this, the Outer Space Treaty, the liability convention really affects then commercial firms, because no commercial firm is going to be able to get investors unless you have insurance, because putting a really, really expensive payload on a bomb makes everybody nervous, because all that technology can blow up in a fraction of a second, and it can blow up in a very inconvenient place. And it can cause a lot of damage, a lot of death and injuries to people. And in order for the commercial firms to raise capital, you have to know who are you going to sue if there is damage from that space mission. And this is taken up then in the Liability Convention of 1972. We then have the Registration Convention in 1976, which establishes then exactly what are the procedures. And the question, about the outer space treaties, who are they registered with? They're registered under the Registration Convention with the Secretary General. And so the Secretary General of the United Nations, that office is the central repository of all the registrations, including all the paperwork from every single space mission and space object, which today can number many tens of thousands. The Chinese just registered that they want to put up to a satellite constellation of 200,000 satellites. So you can imagine 200,000 pieces of, well, not paper. We're setting up now procedures for how do you fulfill your obligations for registering outer space objects and so forth and missions. And finally, the Moon Treaty, 1984, is a treaty that directly, let's say, inherits a lot of its language from the United Nations Conference on Law of the Seas. So the deep seabed was the deep seabed, which is beyond the continental shelves. It's in international territory. It has nodules that are located on the deep seabed. A grad school colleague of mine here at UC Santa Barbara wrote his dissertation a couple of years before I wrote my dissertation. I wrote mine on the geostationary orbit. He wrote his on the deep seabed. The deep seabed is a very, very valuable resource, and especially today with the big attention being given to rare earth minerals and metals that are used in the very highest technologies. And you can read in the press the international politics about does China have the ability to withhold rare earths, minerals from trading partners and so forth? Well, the deep seabed is part of that, along with the whole aspect then of under the Moon Treaty, which is you're going to share the profits from asteroid mining or mining on the moon. And so this is very controversial. One reason why the United States never ratified Law of the Sea Treaty was because of the deep seabed provisions in there and the obligation to share profits. And commercial firms today really don't like the fact that if they set up a mining operation on the moon, is that they would have to share profits from that because it's exploiting a commons resource. Well, because of that, the Moon Treaty has only been ratified by about 15 countries. And it really isn't, it is not really in effect. Even though it is in effect legally, in reality, it really isn't. So, about that later. Okay, now we go to soft law. If the previous slide was about hard law, which is written on paper, everybody signs, ratified, and it becomes then a self-enforcing international treaty because it's ratified and so forth. This is really filling in the gaps that are created by the hard law treaties that are very minimally written, much like the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution consists of 8,000 words. How many words are in the California Constitution? 80,000. Okay, so there's 80,000 words in the California Constitution, 8,000 words in the U.S. Constitution. So there's huge gaps in the U.S. Constitution that are filled by judicial decision-making and by legislation and so forth. This is the legislation that fills in the gaps. And so the difference is that because these are the result of United Nations General Assembly resolutions, these are non-binding. What they represent is the world consensus, but they don't have a hard law basis because the status of these agreements is voluntary. So you sign on and you vote for it, but it would be very, very difficult to sue another country or another entity based on a United Nations General Assembly resolution if it's not backed up by hard law in some place that imposes a direct, let's say, legal obligation, or it enforces compliance by making a state liable for its inaction or its failure to carry out its obligations. But these are very important, in particular, the space debris mitigation resolution in 2007, which makes it obligatory for all states launching objects up into orbit to deorbit these things in a safe manner. The next is the long-term sustainability guidelines passed in 2019, which also establishes what are the, let's say, what are the acceptable practices for countries launching space missions in terms of things such as what types of information are you going to provide? Astronomers really want to know, for instance, if you have thousands of satellites, what are the precise orbits and when are the satellites turned on and off? Because many radio astronomers have ultra-sensitive receivers and they can actually be damaged by the very strong signals coming from satellites flying overhead. We've gone from an era just 15 years ago when there were around 3,000 or 4,000 operating space objects to today, where we have well over 10,000 operating space objects. And that number is likely to go up to over 20,000 within very few years. And so this means that for long-term sustainability of outer space, one is you got to bring the satellites down sooner, and you've also got to establish what are the norms so that all these different users of the outer space environment can all get along. And this is getting really, really tricky because of the big change that's occurring in outer space. And the big change occurring in outer space is that it has gone from being an area that was almost exclusively used only by governments to now it's used almost, well, not exclusively, but it's used predominantly by commercial firms. And this raises then the direct connection between what are the legal obligations for states and the commercial operations or commercial companies that are headquartered or licensed by those countries who are launching then space objects. This was taken up in 2020 by the Artemis Accords. The United States, along with countries such as Luxembourg and others, decided that we really do need to have a much more comprehensive statement of what these directions are that we're going to be going in terms of regulating commercial companies up in outer space and making it an investor-friendly environment. And so remember, follow the money. Follow the money. And the money is that how do you get investors to invest in your space company? How do you make you've all heard the old joke, how do you make a rocket company millionaire? You start with $1 billion and then you form your rocket company, okay? This is the big problem, is that it's very, very expensive to do this. And in order to get investors to feel good about making a very risky investment, you want to establish what are the rules of the road for them to get their money back that they're investing, if they can. And this has to then to do with liability. How do you assign fault? Who's going to provide information? And what are the parameters by which countries are going to interfere with the operations of a commercial space market, which is the topic of today's talk, which is the international system, which today is, let's say, characterized more often by war, and the satellite systems, especially commercial satellite systems, now find themselves in the crosshairs of international war. And how then does this affect, in terms of follow the money, how does this affect then the way in which outer space will be governed? And so this then is the big issue. Okay, having established that, let's get a little bit into the legal weeds. I'll try to keep this as short and sweet as possible. But what are the legal relationships between states and commercial satellite or space mission systems? Okay, number one is in the Outer Space Treaty, Article 6 says that all users of outer space, regardless of whether they're governmental or if they're non-governmental, if they're commercial, scientific, it doesn't matter, is that the country launching the system has to exercise continuing supervision. Okay, so if you go back to the 1960s, and remember, outer space was almost entirely a battle between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it was all governmental, is that back then, the drafters of the Outer Space Treaty were really caught in a dilemma because the Soviet Union And remember, the Soviet Union led the United States for many years in the early 1960s in terms of space technology. Is that they were insistent that outer space could only be explored and used by governmental entities. Okay, that's the Soviet Union. It's a socialist, communist, state owns and does everything, okay, type of totalitarian system. The United States, on the other hand, is a capitalist system, and it has a huge and dynamic commercial technological base. And so they struck a compromise, and the compromise is in Article 6, which says that every country has to exercise continuing supervision of every space system, even if they're commercial and non-governmental. Okay, so that's number one. So exactly what is continuing supervision is also not well defined. And so you have to go back and look at the Artemis Accords and others. And so this is what I'm part of a task force, and we're going to be presenting next month in Vienna a report on precisely these kinds of issues at the UN. Yeah.
Yeah, if the Artemis Accords is not registered through the UN, it looks like that was your slide. Where is it registered, or who runs it?
It's registered, well, it's held by the, there's a report sent to the Secretary General. They know all about it. But each country signing on gets a copy. Okay, so they have a copy of it. There is another international non-UN agreement. It's called the International Lunar Research Station, ILRS, signed by China and the Russians, and nobody knows what the text is. But it's to regulate Chinese and Russian operations on the moon, and especially moon mining. And moon mining is big business these days. There are literally billions of dollars being spent on developing space systems and technologies for moon mining. We'll get into that. The Outer Space Treaty Article 11, which says that all space missions have to be performed with due regard to the interests of everybody else in outer space. Okay, due regard. Okay, it's like the Supreme Court Justice, who was it, who said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. Due regard, okay, I can't define due regard, but I know it when I see it. Okay, which means that you're supposed to carry out your space missions with due regard, that is, with consideration for everybody else. And you have to register it. Okay, so registration, and what this Article 11 says, you have to register your space missions with and specifying who's the launching state, who or what is the nature of the mission, and where is it going to be. And if you go then into the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, there's a registration requirement there where you have to say what is your orbit and what are your frequencies. And so that there are these registration requirements so that everybody should know what everybody else is doing up there. Because the only way, again, to make sure that outer space is done in the interest of all and it's done for peaceful purposes is if everybody knows what's going on. And this is a very problematical thing, especially if you're a commercial company and this information is proprietary. Okay, if it's proprietary, is your launching state country compelled to force you to expose proprietary information in these disclosures? This is a really follow the money. You've got hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in these very risky endeavors. And now you're going to tell us we have to now expose ourselves by registering proprietary information. The liability convention and the registration convention, in other words, if something hits your satellite, something hits somebody on the ground in an airplane, whatever, you want to be able to sue them. If you've lost family members because your airliner was hit with space debris, you want to be able to sue them. We just had a meteor crash, and a piece of meteor went through a roof in Germany and into a bedroom. But that was a natural space object that we didn't see coming because the sun blinds us to many near-Earth objects. But just as that is a natural occurrence, we also have then the examples of where space objects have re-entered and caused damage on the ground. And who are you going to sue? And this is then the big issue, because if you're an investor, you want to make sure that the company that you are investing with is properly insured and that they're legally able to operate out there so that you can sue somebody else. And so this then is one of the big aspects. Then following, I've been talking on the international side. Now if we go down to the national level, each country is being, because there are well over 150 countries now with satellites up in orbit. That is to say, they have a satellite that's registered to them. So after launch, you can have an agreement whereby the registration is transferred from the launching state to the operating state. And so what the United Nations is involved with is training many, many countries to now establish space legislation and a space agency that will supervise their satellite up there. Because once you get a satellite up there, you're liable. Okay, it's got to be registered to somebody, and it makes then that registrant liable for any damage, either on the Earth, in orbit, or wherever. So on the national level, we want all countries operating satellites to have a space agency, because in the middle of the night, you got to have a phone number you can call. Yes?
Due regard, be a nice neighbor, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so when you launch something, and I don't know what the safe space is between satellites are, but are you supposed to like model that for 5 years before it drops out and then see how close you get?
Well, that is
Or
one of,
you just have to say, it's going to do this orbit, and nobody cares about what's happening in the space.
SpaceX does approximately 2,000 maneuvers per month in order to avoid collisions. So because they're operating the biggest constellation. I mean, they've got to really worry about where everything is. So they have to constantly maneuver their satellites around. So your question was then,
So they don't have to model like natural decay of the orbit. They just move it around.
how long in advance do we want to be able to predict a possible conjunction? A conjunction is a collision. And so this is the tricky thing. And this is one of the applications they're hoping that AI can assist with, because AI can go through a massive amount of data very, very fast and be able to, let's say, pinpoint what are the most likely conjunctions, but several months in advance. See, there's so many factors at work here, in terms of what's going on in Earth orbit, for instance, because For instance, one example is the sun is constantly variable. That is to say, the amount of solar wind coming off the sun and hitting the earth has a direct effect on the ability of these satellites to maintain their proper orbits, because they have to be in a proper constellation. And I mean, it's incredible when you think about, and in fact, at the Santa Barbara Amateur Radio Club meeting about a year ago, we had a meeting and a guy sitting there, he wrote the software for the Starlink modems. Now, a Starlink modem, they're doing inter-satellite links between satellites. These satellites are moving very fast relative to each other, which means the Doppler shifts are constantly changing. You have constantly changing Doppler shifts. And you just think about, if you want to maintain a high data rate, you've got to have now your software able to constantly monitor, are you approaching, are you departing, what angle, all that stuff. I mean, it's an incredibly complicated thing in order to do the adjustments just for Doppler shift in an intersatellite link. And so this is part of the problem that they have in dealing with this. Okay, so what's the solution? To find the solution, we have to also look at what is the cause of the problem. And the problem is overpopulation in Earth orbit and the expanding use of commercial space systems by states for military purposes. And why is this occurring? States used to do all of this themselves because of the fact that they preferred to have complete control over their weapon systems, and they were only very, very reluctant to give up the control they had because that represents in their mindset a vulnerability. If you don't control it, then you don't have that assurance that it's going to be there and it's going to be doing what you want it to do. For instance, back in 1982, there was a very, very big court case about the breakup of AT&T. AT&T, which was the world's biggest corporation, had 90% of all the telephones in the United States. And who led the charge to stop the breakup of AT&T's monopoly that they had over telephones in the United States? And it was the Department of Defense. So here's where the Reagan administration actually went against its own Department of Defense, because the Department of Defense is the biggest customer of AT&T. And the Department of Defense liked having one-stop shopping of a system where, because they were the biggest customer, they were sure AT&T would always do what DoD wanted. Who knows what all these little commercial companies, because if you break up AT&T into little commercial companies, now DoD has to negotiate contracts with a myriad of companies. No one-stop shopping. And so this then was a problem. So what propels regime change? Well, one is the changing legal norms and beliefs about the rule of law. And there's a big debate going on that's been going on for a very, very long time. Is there international law? Is there international law? So very fundamental question. There is international law, but do countries follow it? And there's a debate. I taught international law as a political factor for many years. And this is controversial because in order to have a rule of law, don't you need to have somebody to enforce it? To what degree, then, is the international community able to enforce a law or a rule that they promulgate? And this, then, is a belief system about this rule of law. On the one hand, international law exists. Why? Because it's created by states. They're sovereign. And as sovereign entities, they create international law. Why? Because it benefits them. They want international law. Why do you want international law? Follow the money. They want to have a stable, predictable environment in which to operate. Because in their systems, all these commercial companies also want to have a stable, predictable environment. If you have rules, you feel a lot better. You can sleep at night because you know who you can sue, right? Because everybody's going to follow it. And so this is very, very big. You can see that this is a very, very big thing these days with the Straits of Hormuz. Okay, and you can imagine the lawyers around the world sharpening their knives. This is the greatest thing to happen to Putin and international lawyers ever since that ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. And what that cost, now you look at what is going on then with the Straits of Hormuz and all the liability that you have with these ships now being faced with force majeure, because most insurance contracts is specifically exempt force majeure from being one of those conditions that you can sue somebody for damage. Okay, international law and the treaties and principal scholarly publications. These are the sources of international law, which are one, treaty law that's written down on a piece of paper. Customary international law is what do states actually do. You don't have to have a written treaty if you can, let's say, identify a common practice amongst sovereign states. That common practice establishes customary international law. For instance, there's a very famous international legal case called the Paquette Havana. Paquette Havana were fishing boats, and during the Spanish-American War, fishing boats were considered to be off limits to military engagements. They were civilian, and they were, if you damaged one, then that was illegal under the rules of war. And that was what all states did. All states tended to avoid damaging fishing boats. Okay, fishing boats, civilian, they were. Then they discovered radio. Now fishing boats were spy boats with radio. And so now they were targets. And so the behavior of states changed with radio. And so customary international law changed. Now fishing boats are targets, just like commercial satellite systems. Commercial satellite systems, which in the old days were really off limits, now they're targets. Okay, customary international law. You also have general principles of law, such as reciprocity and so forth, proportionality. You're not supposed to, let's say, use non-proportional force in reaction to an attack on your territory and so forth. And then finally, scholarly publications. But the other big change is in systemic changes. How much? Oh, okay. We're reaching the end of time, aren't we? Yeah, okay. I just want to bring up what's changing international law is what this Nobel Prize winner, Oliver Williamson, won the Nobel Prize for. And what he said in his research is that if you want to find out how something is governed, look at the transaction costs. And that institutions, countries, governments, commercial entities, they are all established by transaction costs. And so the transaction costs actually are the biggest factor of change that you can see in our, let's say, civilization and system. And what's happening in outer space is that with the diminution of information transaction costs and so forth, we are reaching a state in the international system today very similar to about 500 years ago, which is where mainly the Portuguese developed a new technology for ships, and the new technology for ships allowed the Portuguese to access the Spice Islands, breaking up the monopoly that the Indians and Middle East Arab traders had for bringing spices into the European markets, mainly because the transaction costs were so much lower being able to do it by ship. And this is what the Portuguese did. This is what Columbus was trying to do. And this changed the entire balance of power in the world, because the greatest source of wealth, which was South Asia seas and Indonesia, suddenly now shifted in favor of other countries, breaking up the monopoly that used to be held then by the Indians and Indonesians and Middle East traders. The second is information technology. The development in 1451 of movable type by Gutenberg completely changed the balance of power between man and God, and the transaction costs for accessing the world of God went down by a huge factor due to the printing press. And this completely changed Europe, threw it into the 30 Years' War, which, proportionate to the population, was the bloodiest war Europe has ever fought. And it was due to, this also created a lot of war, but these two changes in the transaction costs directly resulted in these changes that we see. World trade routes in 1600 with the new technology. And let's just take a look at that and compare it then to, those are undersea cables. So undersea cables follow world trade. And world trade today is a huge factor cheaper than it ever was before, because fiber optic undersea cables and the internet. And so if you have a society that where the profitability of various companies are determined really by how they manipulate information, and especially today with AI, this, and now the big interest in data centers is really fueling all this. This is also true for the ICT expenditures that we can see worldwide. Anybody guess how much is going to be spent on AI by the year 2030? It's going to be $1 trillion, easily, easily. Everybody's going to be out of work, but if you have stock in NVIDIA, you're living under yacht. 5G expenditures and beyond. Okay, this is to empower your handheld personal device. And we're going to go to 6G and faster. And why? AI. Okay, AI reduces, we've had AI a long time. We've had it well over 50, 60 years. The difference is that the transaction costs came down. We always had AI, but now it's cheap. And so this is why it's so much in play. And the number of Internet of Things, we're going to have 29 billion devices on the Internet of Things. That's probably a very conservative number. Who's going to be, how do you interconnect all these things? And increasingly, it's going to be through the use of space systems. And for warfare, the big thing that's changing, this is from 2023, but already the information intensity of the Russian-Ukrainian war has completely changed warfare, whereby today Ukraine is saying to the United States, it will provide the United States with these very, very efficient anti-drone drones in exchange for Patriot missiles. And this is what Ukraine, all these people have real career after the war is over, because they are the world's expert on drones and artificial intelligence used for drones and for targeting of these kinds of attacks. This is a direct reduction in transaction costs. Kinetic warfare is way too expensive. You now conduct your warfare with standoff weapons that are increasingly guided then by artificial intelligence. Cyber conflict in space and Earth is only picking up. This is showing you where the GPS spoofing is going on. And so you can map this using satellites, and it's increasingly commercial satellites looking at how all these things are going to be regulated. I'm going to jump ahead. And so what we have then finally is, what does the international legal regime then for commercial satellite and space systems, what does it look like? And we have three main areas of governance of this big expanding commercial space realm. The first is the United Nations. This is the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and they're putting together now the rules by which nation states will then have a standard by which to compare their actions. If you go over to the International Telecommunication Union, and they're increasingly dealing with aspects of artificial intelligence, and how then do we establish in the spectrum area, which is being very rapidly militarized, as countries increasingly turn to the economies that you can affect in being able to shoot down drones, aircraft, and other flying and non-flying devices using spectrum and spectrum weapons. Remember, a laser weapon is a spectrum weapon. So if you're using lasers to shoot down drones, you're actually using spectrum. And anything in the electromagnetic realm is becoming a very, very intense area of interest in future warfare. The internet, I pose as, if you want to understand how outer space with commercial entities is going to be governed in the future, look at how the internet is being governed today. And the outer space legal regime is moving from one that was based on the 1960s idea of outer space being run by governmental entities. It's moving towards a model that's much closer to what the internet uses. The internet really does not exist as the internet. The internet exists as the voluntary interconnection of networks using common software protocols to interconnect the networks. It's non-binding because it's voluntary. So the internet is a voluntary, let's say, infrastructure that takes owned and operated networks, and those owners and operators then voluntarily interconnect themselves. How do you establish the rules for a operating internet? Well, my proposition is that if you want to understand outer space, look at the way in which the internet is governed, and that will tell you a lot about what's going to happen in outer space. Specifically, non-binding, let's say, rules such as the Artemis Accords, and you have then a self-enforcing system, because the internet is self-enforcing, because if you don't do it right, it stops working. And so its legitimacy is performance-based. So performance-based legitimacy, because you can dream up any legal requirement or any legal, let's say, agreement, but if that legal requirement or legal agreement doesn't lead to something that works, then it's useless, completely useless. And for the internet, it's very simple. Does it work or doesn't it work? And with computer technology, it's literally one bit. You could have one bit that's wrong and it'll stop working. So it has to be a system that works. And so this is legitimacy through performance. Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope that we can engage in some discussion, and I'm open to any questions. Yes, back.
I lived in Hawaii in 1973, 74, and I'm looking at your list that you put up. It would have been 1982 that the satellite television broadcasting system began.
No, it was the resolution. It's the United Nations resolution about satellite broadcasting.
Okay, well, so I still sort of have a question. I was living in DC before I moved to Hawaii during the Watergate era and really enjoyed watching the Watergate hearings every day, glued to them. Walter Cronkite, I loved it. When I moved to Hawaii, I had to wait for the United Airlines to ship the tapes over to watch all this. It was very frustrating, except on Sundays, I got football, Dallas Cowboys, Washington Redskins, Monday Night Football. It was there. So the NFL could afford a satellite. How do they transmit that?
Follow the money.
So they have the money for a satellite.
Follow the money. Follow the money. Because Hawaii, because of its strategic military location on Earth, it's always had satellite. Ever since the very beginnings of satellite, Hawaii has always been there. I visited in 1983. I was the first time I went to the Pacific Telecommunications Conference. We had a field trip to the ComSat Standard A terminal, which is in the North Shore of Oahu. And they had it all set up for direct satellite television.
So why didn't NBC or ABC, why didn't they?
It wasn't worth it to them to play that stuff until you have a football game. And the advertisers follow the money.
Yeah.
Follow the money. Yeah.
Well, some of us are concerned with technocracy, the surveillance of all of us Americans at a very detailed level. So with AI being potentially, it could be good used for good and bad. And the fact that we don't really follow law, our country anymore, it seems. International law doesn't appear to be worth anything right now. What are you putting anything in place to put some guardrails on AI and the use of satellites for surveillance and all this stuff that we don't want as Americans who care about freedom don't want?
Yeah, that's really a great question because it strikes to the heart of the Constitution.
Oh, we have one? Oh.
She asked rhetorically. Because what it comes down to is that we also have in the United Nations system, we have a non-binding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so we have then international agreements for human rights. But the problem is how then do you operationalize or how do you enforce them? Now in Europe, they have, for instance, the European Court of Human Rights, and they've dealt with some privacy issue cases where if you're in a European Union country, then you can sue based on European human rights law. In the United States, you have under the Constitution and under states' laws, for instance, California has a very strict privacy law that is based on the GDPR, the General Directive on Privacy Regulation of Europe. So really, California just took the European law and passed it in California. But that is only going to affect you if you're in California and a California entity is involved. AI, one of the solutions for AI, because AI uses up a lot of electricity and a lot of water, is how then are you going to build out AI in a economical fashion? And one of the proposals is put it up in outer space. You can put, and this is what Elon is talking about, you can put your satellites up in a sun synchronous orbit so they get sunlight on their solar panels 24/7. And they can be up in orbit and they're going around the Earth. And you can then reduce the load on earthbound resources like water and electricity by putting them up into space. The problem is who has jurisdiction over a satellite that's up in orbit? And the answer is whatever country is directly below it. Okay, so if, for instance, a satellite, because AI is all about transmitting information back and forward, okay? You want to be able to exchange information, otherwise it's worthless. So it is under outer space law and air terrestrial law, if a satellite is going over a national territory of a state, that state has jurisdiction over what that satellite can do. So a country can say, like Iran, it is illegal to use a Starlink terminal and use a Starlink satellite. Okay, so if the Starlink satellite is going over Iran, well, the United States was airdropping in Starlink terminals to help the Iranian protesters against the Iranian government. But legally, the Iranian government, being a recognized government, has jurisdiction. So they can say, you're violating Iranian citizens' privacy rights by interconnecting. You're tracking us. You're on Facebook, you're on Google, and you're tracking Iranian citizens in our territory. And that's against our law. We're going to shut you down. So legally, they can go to the International Telecommunication Union and say, Starlink is operating illegally. They're not shutting down their satellite over Iranian territory. And that is illegal. Okay. Now, under reciprocity, it doesn't go very far because normally other countries have satellites, and reciprocity, starting with Sputnik. Why didn't the United States ban the overflight of US territory by Sputnik in 1957? Because we were going to operate one. Okay, so sure. I mean, reciprocity. I mean, if we protest the Soviet Union overflight, then they're going to protest our overflight. And what did we want to use the satellites for? To spy on the Soviet Union, just as they wanted to use their satellite to spy on the United States. So very quickly, customary international law set up a norm, and it says, okay, everybody's satellite can overfly the other country's territory, but you can overfly it. What can the satellite legally do? Okay. And so here's where it gets really tricky, because a satellite going over US territory, it's gathering all this privacy information about it, and it can be stored on the satellite. And then it goes over another country, and that country says, hey, do a data dump. Is that legal? Okay. Is your data then being protected, your personal data, all your movements and everything else? And remember, your internet service provider knows all the porn sites that you visit. They do. They really do. Let's use a VPN. Okay. So all that data could be dumped down into a third country. Who knows what kind of privacy laws and regulations they have? This is a really big problem. Yeah.
Larry, you're obviously very smart, but you're not a lawyer, right?
Not a lawyer.
Okay, and you're flying to Vienna,
Yeah.
so I'm following the money. I'm
Yeah.
trying to figure this one out. You're flying to Vienna on your own because you're like super smart, or are you a consultant to a government, or just all the space wonks?
No, I just do it for fun, actually.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. Because I'm retired and all my friends are in these conferences and meetings. And so it's just a lot of fun and I'm just by nature interested in outer space and the internet governance. And so there are, I mean, I wouldn't say I would turn down something, but I hate having to work for money if you don't have to. So it's a lot more fun just to go get a cheap hotel room. And it doesn't cost anything to go to the UN meetings other than the flight there and back. And it's free to get into the UN once you get, you know, your security clearance and everything taken care of. And the International Institute of Space Law is a permanent observer of the UN Outer Space Committee. And it's a permanent observer at the ITU and at other places. So by being affiliated with the International Institute of Space Law, we're part of this community of scholars who have, as I have, I used to work in the government, then I went to academia, went back to the government, went back to academia. And so there are people that and in the United States, it's very, very common, not so common elsewhere, that you have a revolving door. So those of you who've lived around DC, you know about the, it's called the Beltway Bandits. And the Beltway Bandits are all the consulting firms out by Tyson's Corner, you know, out there by the Beltway. And these are people that work in the government, they go to private industry, then oftentimes they go into a research or academic. And so you're doing this three-way. And one of my really good friends that I met in 1982 in Vienna at the Unispace, the United Nations Outer Space Committee, his name is Rich Dalbello. He just retired as head of the agency in NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they were in charge of a question that you brought up, which was TRACS. And TRACS, TRACSS, is the software system for tracking satellites. So they had a $40 million budget from the federal government to develop TRACS that would establish a common basis for everyone exchanging information about their satellite systems that they're operating in order to prevent collisions so that everybody can get along, okay, in a way that doesn't compromise to an unacceptable degree the proprietary nature a lot of the information and the military sensitivity of the information. And so he got his LLM at McGill University. He then worked in the U.S. Department of Commerce. He actually hired me for a while. And then we've been very, very good friends as he goes into the private sector. So he was vice president for government affairs of Virgin Galactic when they were launching tourists up on the Virgin Galactic airplane. And we watched the launch in Iceland. We were driving around Iceland, but we got out his computer and we were watching on the closed Virgin Galactic network because he was vice president of government affairs for that. So in the United States, it's very common for people to, you know, move around. Yeah.
Well, we have a question from Mary. What can we do to try to ensure that space usage stays beneficial to human beings?
Yeah,
I'm talking about those of us who have a lot of formal expertise in things like engineering and science, but we are not versed in the law.
Yeah, this is a really big issue these days because in the olden days, all this stuff was undertaken by governments.
Yeah.
Because it was so expensive that you had an entity like JPL. Okay, so JPL and NASA would undertake these really high-risk exploratory missions. And so, for instance, the first remote sensing satellites were launched then. Landsat was launched then by NASA, U.S. government. They were operated by the U.S. government. And so Landsat satellites could do these huge surveys of the Earth's surface, which really assisted farmers, it assisted climatologists, it assisted many different scientific engagements. And it was all data that was made available to everyone because it was paid for by the taxpayers. So the taxpayers are paying for these missions. They're paying for the rockets, the satellites, the dissemination of the data. With the reduction of transaction costs, when it got cheaper to launch into orbit with the private launch companies, and because the technology kept getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, is that now you have commercial remote sensing companies. Right. And the commercial remote sensing companies have a much better resolution. So in the old days, 10-meter resolution was norm. And what's going to happen when we get to 1-meter resolution? That is, from orbit, you can see 1 pixel is 1 meter. Now you're down to where it's like spy satellites, literally. And the reduction of costs means that commercial companies are collecting this data and they're selling it to the highest bidder. That could be a military establishment or it could be a commercial company. So for instance, if you're a geologically oriented company looking for likely oil reserves, you're going to want this data because it very economically can survey large swaths of the earth and be able to tell you something.
Yeah,
if the data only goes to the highest bidder, who's not getting it? The poor countries.
Yeah.
Who are being sensed. And so you end up with a situation where an outsider knows more about your country's resources than you know about your own country's resources. And so that gives them a huge bargaining advantage. And so the peaceful uses or the economic uses for development means that one, and this is what the resolution about remote sensing was about, is that it should be available on a non-discriminatory basis, is that you can't discriminate and that every country, if it's being flown over, it should have a say in whether or not it agrees to be scanned. And secondly, it should have access to information about itself. The third part of it is it legal to sell that remote sensing information to a military establishment somewhere? Because they're willing to pay a lot of money for it because it can give them up to the hour, up to the minute, updates on where are the troops, where are the tanks, where are the electronic, because you can measure actually which frequencies are being used on the ground. You can pinpoint movements of your adversary. And so this also represents a direct, let's say, challenge to the objectives of the outer space legal regime that it be used for peaceful purposes. So
I know what's happening. The question is, what can we as normal people who are scientists, who are engineers, who are whatever, some of whom need this data, thinking of climatologists, I'm thinking of water resources, et cetera, to ensure that we're not left out and that the poor countries are not left out. That's the challenge. It's not, we know what's happening and we know how money is controlling it, but how do we get beyond that? And you may not have any suggestions. We can see what's happening.
Well, we're working very diligently at the United Nations to promote the rule of law. Because if you look at the pre-existing treaties and if you look at the pre-existing non-binding agreements that represent the consensus of humankind, is that basically there's enough law there, but it has to be given some enforcement capability. And
Yes.
so what we need to do is to have, as I was mentioning before, to have each country develop and let's say establish with full regulatory powers a space agency in that country that ensures that that country is carrying out its obligations. Because in many cases, this is largely due to non-enforceability due to the lack of a regulatory presence even. And so with so many countries now coming into the space age, into space capabilities, is that you need to have, there's got to be somebody you can call on the phone. Who are you going to call? This was always the gripe about the European Union is you're being attacked. Who do you call at 3 a.m? There was no European defense minister. Okay, there was nobody to call. You call Brussels, you could talk to NATO, but that's not Europe. That's NATO.
Right.
And so with outer space, you want to have a space agency and a phone number. And I bring that up. It sounds sort of wishy-washy, but there is a case of where China was predicting a collision with another satellite, with its satellites, and it sent emails to SpaceX saying, hey, you guys are going to hit us. And SpaceX never received the email, or they claim they never received the email. And this became an incident because then the Chinese said, well, this proves that these commercial companies cannot be trusted.
Yeah.
And so it then comes down to the United States Federal Communications Commission that establishes many of the rules for frequencies, overflight rights, and because Starlink is registered in the United States, is that the United States has a direct regulatory role to play. And so it's much easier, to answer your question, it's much easier as a private citizen or group to go to your own national agency than it is to try to go to the international side.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.